Hi, this is Jürgen Rasmus, and welcome to the Provocative Hypnosis vlog. Today's topic is when therapy does more harm than good. When psychotherapy, hypnotherapy, NLP coaching, change work, whatever you're up to, when it does more harm than good. Now, here's something that fascinates me to no end. It can be difficult enough to get a lot of coaches and therapists to talk openly about failures in therapy, meaning clients who don't improve or don't experience any change. But what's even more difficult is to get someone to talk about a client who is actually worse off after seeing that particular therapist than before. Sometimes clients can actually become worse off after therapeutic work. And so far, I've asked this of a bunch of psychotherapists and hypnotherapists. Have you ever had a client who actually got worse after seeing you? I can't recall a single person yet who has said yes. But they all know of someone else. Like they all know of some other therapist who they would not recommend, who they're pretty sure that some clients are worse off. But of course, no one is that therapist themselves. And that is kind of interesting. So let's delve into this a little bit. Back in 1962, the APA, American Psychological Association, had a meeting about the so-called Wisconsin Project. There were a bunch of high-ranking psychologists there, Carl Rogers perhaps being the most prominent one, who wanted to, through this Wisconsin Project, demonstrate how effective psychotherapy could be. But the problem was that instead of getting a lot of data about how people improved, they got quite a bit of data about how people did not, in fact, improve. And 4 years later, in 1966, a guy called Alan Bergen documented that about 10% of people were worse off after psychotherapy. So many people believe that psychotherapy and coaching is risk-free. They might have an idea that medication poses certain risks, but that psychotherapy is always benign. Like the worst thing that could ever happen, right, is that nothing happens. This is quite simply not true. So there are quite a few interventions or psychological techniques that people are convinced that work. Even the patients themselves are very enthusiastic about it, but when you do controlled studies, it often shows that the people who have done the interventions are no better off than the people who have not done the interventions, and B, in some cases, they're actually worse off. So a very good example of this is what's called debriefing, or critical incident stress debriefing. This was done, for example, in the United States after 9/11 with firefighters and police officers. It's been done a lot with soldiers, emergency personnel. Here in Norway, where I live, the Red Cross has had a tendency to recommend it. After the Utøya massacre back in 2011, people were subjected to debriefing. And a debriefing session often lasts for 3 or 4 hours. And the idea is to get the person to really empty out, like to describe what happened in detail and to share their deepest thoughts and feelings and get everything out. in a very detailed way. And the intent is for people to not get traumatized or develop what's called PTSD. Although only about 20% of people who have been through so-called traumatic experiences um, develop what's called PTSD. Now, the really ironic thing is that, it seems like a common sense thing to do. Like, let's get the person to talk about it the exact same day and to just get everything out there. And people who have been doing debriefing have been very enthusiastic about it. And quite often, the people who have gone through it have said, yeah, this really helped me. But of course, they have no idea what their experience would have been like hadn't they gone through the debriefing. But there have been enough controlled studies that show that debriefing doesn't work. The people who go through debriefing are not better off than people who don't go through debriefing. In fact, they're most often way worse off. The people who go through debriefing, more of them are more depressed, more anxious, more traumatized than the people in the control groups. So that would be my first hint to you is if you're doing debriefing, stop doing debriefing. Or if you're an emergency personnel, a soldier, a police officer, or you've been through some sort of traumatic thing and you get offered to do debriefing, don't do it. There seems to be something about doing the debriefing on the same day or shortly thereafter that kind of freezes the memories, to use a metaphor, and that disrupts the brain's natural way of processing it. One thing that actually is documented to work is James Penbaker's old, trauma writing exercise, where after a few weeks you check in with the person and you ask, is this a topic for you? And if it is, you have them sit down with pen and paper for at least 15 minutes, 3 or 4 days in a row, and you have them write down their deepest thoughts and feelings about it. For most people, that works. That actually works. Debriefing does not work. Why does this work? Well, most likely because when people are traumatized, they have been unable to sort the experience, to make a meaningful narrative, and to kind of conclude. So when someone sits down a few weeks after the event and they grab pen and paper and they might start out quite incoherently and get themselves to organize a structured narrative of what happens and what it means. As soon as they can conclude, the brain has a tendency to rest, and they're over it. So that's one example of therapy that often does more harm than good. There's a lot of different, let's see what I have here in my notes. There's a lot of different social programs that have been shown to not work. So any group therapy, I would recommend that you be very cautious about. So for example, there was a guy by the name of Richard Cabot, a medical doctor, who did something called the Cambridge Somerville Youth Study, where he had thousands of kids, not privileged kids, people who came from poor, impoverished backgrounds. And the whole idea was if you could get these kids involved in summer camps with other similar kids, and where they would get a lot of resources, one or more adults who would talk to them, give them resources, guide them, counsel them, that would be extremely beneficial. Like it just seems like a common sense thing to do. But 30 years later, a psychologist by the name of Joan McLeod was able to get access to several hundred people who had been through that program. And what she discovered, compared to people who had not been part of that program, is that they were way likely to be drug addicted, to have been to prison, to be abusing alcohol, to have problems with anxiety and depression. Not just a little bit, but quite a bit more. And the big question is like, why doesn't this work? And a very likely answer is that when people are teenagers, they're more concerned with their peers than they often are with adults. And putting kids who struggle, who are depressed and anxious, and together and get them to associate with each other tends to make people worse off. So it's a bit like if you put a lot of anxious people or depressed people in a group together and they start to, get friendships with people who are in a similar predicament, and they base their identity around the very problem they claim to want to solve, that's usually not a good thing. There's other programs. For example, in the States, something called DARE, where people were at schools kind of indoctrinated into or to be scared of drugs and alcohol and the horrible consequences. And the whole idea was to make it as realistic as possible. So like police officers would be undercover in the schoolyards and attempt to sell drugs to kids and stuff like that. And in the United States, hundreds of millions of dollars have been spent on these DARE programs. In Norway, you have something called Motivasjonskollektivet i Akershus, which was a similar program. Same thing here. The people who have gone through these programs are actually more likely to be involved with drugs and alcohol abuse than people who have not. Scared Straight is another famous program where you took people who theoretically could be predisposed to do crime and violence and stuff like that, and you took them to prisons and had them spend a day or several days over time with hardcore criminals who would scare them and tell them about rape and murder and how bad things would be on the inside, and the whole idea was to scare people straight. But again, later on, when you look at the more controlled studies, it shows that people who have gone through these Scared Straight programs are actually more likely to be involved in crime. So one thing could be just getting together with other kids who might be struggling a bit and identifying with those. But a likely explanation is kind of a boomerang effect. Like if you have someone who's not that interested in drugs or being a violent offender or a criminal to begin with, that's not really part of their self-concept. And then you send them to one of these Scared Straight programs, it's likely that a lot of them will get a new self-narrative where they kind of go, geez, since they think they have to scare the crap out of me to not do this stuff, maybe I inherently have some inkling or some urge, maybe I kind of am that person who's naturally drawn towards those things. Same also goes, for example, here in Norway we had something Scared Straight, something called Ullersmo-prosjektet, which also did not have any good results. In Norway, too, we have something called SOTP for sex offenders. Group therapy combined with cognitive therapy for sex offenders. And again, it seems like a good idea, but the data shows that these sex offender programs internationally are not effective. Like there's no good evidence to suggest that these sex offenders are less likely to reoffend after having gone through these programs. As a matter of fact, with SOTP here in Norway, 10% of the people who have been through that do new sexual offenses. And the number for those who haven't been through that program is actually quite a bit less. So one concern is that, again, the whole group dynamic thing, that maybe by identifying with fellow inmates and hearing their story of having abused, that the whole thing gets normalized in a sense and gets acceptable in a sense, that they kind of get off on listening to the other offenders do their thing. And also the problem solving skills, the communication skills that they're learning. There's a worry that a lot of these people just become more sophisticated offenders, more dangerous offenders, essentially. Um, what else do we have here when I was working on this? Well, obviously, and I've made videos about this before, so I'm not going to go into this in detail again, but anything that smacks of recovered memories or repressed memories, meaning any therapist who sells you the idea that your symptoms or your suffering is indicative of past trauma, and if you can't remember the trauma, it means that you've repressed it. And that now you're going to use dream work or body work or group work or hypnosis to lift the depression, to heal the trauma. Run like hell. This was the biggest scandal in psychology in the United States in the late 80s and 90s. According to science writer Mark Pendergrass, there were likely several 100,000 people in the US alone who discovered memories of sexual abuse that they did not know about before the therapy. And these memories are in all likelihood complete fabrications. So there's no evidence that recovered memory therapy helps people or that people are better off after doing it. They're actually, in fact, more likely to be worse off after doing it. Not to mention the consequences of family members and others being accused of abuse, and sometimes families being torn apart and innocent people being sent to jail. Another thing, to steer away from is, of course, anyone who suggests that you have alters or multiple personalities, that there's really someone else inside of you that's kind of doing these things, and might that one want to speak, and that's something to steer away from as well. What's called attachment and holding therapies. This is quite popular. It's been quite popular in Norway. It's even more popular in Denmark. It's these therapies where you take often autistic kids or kids who have been abused, in foster families who have a lot of problems with attachment and trust, where you hold them down and restrain them and force them to have eye contact with you until they kind of give in and surrender, and you get to talk about their bad stuff. Again, there's no evidence that this helps people, and quite a bit of evidence that it does more harm than good. Another interesting fad was what was called FC, or facilitated communication. I'm going to find something here from Thomas Szazz's book, The Meaning of Mind. I'm going to quote him on a couple of things here. This was developed by Rosemary Crossley in Melbourne, Australia in the 1970s. So the technique consisted of a so-called facilitator holding a keyboard of the alphabet in front of the subject and bracing his hand and arm to enable him to spell out the message he wanted to convey. It was originally done with people who had neuromuscular disorders, but then they started to use it with autistic children. And the idea was that the person who was holding the keyboard was a facilitator who was just facilitating what was in the subject. But this proved to be catastrophic. And what ended up happening, of course, was that the kid's arm was used to spell out the fantasies of the so-called facilitator and not the subject. So I'll read something here from Szazz's book. An 8-year-old boy wrote a lengthy report of sexual abuse by his mother. The transcript was more than 20 pages in length and contained correctly spelled, anatomically correct descriptions of oral, genital, sex, and sodomy. The patient's mother was extremely distressed and expressed suicidal ideation and required psychiatric hospitalization. The patient was hospitalized in another psychiatric facility and subsequently placed in foster care. No evidence of physical or sexual abuse was found. Of course, later there's been a consensus that what was discovered in facilitated communication did not have to do with the subject, but it had to do with the so-called facilitator. Again, quoting Szazz, this is an excellent book, by the way, The Meaning of Mind. He has a really interesting thing here. There are important lessons in this story about memory as reminding and about psychiatry as agency denying. Autism and facilitated communication, quoting Szazz here. The facilitator disowns his semantic agency and attributes his own voice to the autistic child. The supporters of FC, facilitated communication, hoping that autism masks a normal mind, accept the facilitator's rejection of agency and validate his attributing his voice to the subject. Schizophrenia and psychiatry. The hallucinating patient disowns his semantic agency and attributes his own voice to voices, in quotation marks. Psychiatrists, hoping that madness masks a diseased brain, accept the patient's rejections of agency and validate his attributing his voice to brain disease. Something to contemplate. Of course, outside of this, I think if you look at psychology and psychiatry for the last 50 years, especially since the DSM-3 came out in 1980, the amount of influence that these professions have over our lives is just profound. From education, healthcare, prison systems, media articles, pharmaceutical companies, it's just mind-boggling. But you might ask, are people better off today than they were in 1980 or 1950? Are they psychologically more resilient, happier, have better relationships? As a matter of fact, teenagers today have higher suicide rates, more self-harm, higher rates of depression, higher rates of anxiety. We're more psychiatrized and psychologized than ever, and we seem to be suffering more collectively than we used to. So it might be a good idea to really look at these fields and perhaps consider if overall they might be doing more harm than good. Of course, any medicalization, anything that encourages a victim identity, I'm not saying that people can't be victimized by things in life, but the victim identity, the idea that your problems in living, your psychological suffering, the idea that it's a medical disease, a disease of the brain to be medicated or treated or electroshocked. The idea that you have a broken brain and not that much that you can do for yourself and that you need therapy and drugs and experts. This tendency to medicalize our problems of living has exploded since the DSM-3 came out in 1980. And at least my experience with clients is that anything that encourages people to view to have the sick role, to view oneself as a victim, makes people less compassionate, less wise, and less resourceful than they otherwise would have been. Not to mention less kind towards other people around them. So any form of change work that seeks to take your problems in living and to medicalize them into diseases without there being any proof that there's anything wrong in your brain to treat, good reason to be skeptical. I had something else here too. Yeah, of course, past lives therapy I would run for the hills. You know, like the one of the worst things I ever saw was a person who had been through past lives therapy and they never found anything in the past life, allegedly, but they became convinced that they needed to access a past life to, you know, have a better life. Again, since it's what the client hears that actually generates a change, you could do all sorts of craziness and sometimes, you know, get a good result. But there's really no good evidence that there really is anything like a past life, or that you have to go through a past life to dredge up memories, or that this is even useful. Even if you're doing conventional CBT or exposure therapy or things that have some scientific backing, there's no guarantee that someone might not be worse off after the work before they came in. And the reason for that is it's because it's what the client hears. It's the dots that the client connects that's going to determine what they get out of the change work. And you can't guarantee or control that what the client hears resembles anything you've actually suggested or said. So let's say that you do exposure therapy, for example, and you're a well-known helper. The client trusts in you, and they've read that exposure therapy is among the, you know, the most effective way to deal with a phobia. And let's say you do exposure therapy with them, and their fears increase to such a point that they bail out of the change work and they don't come back, for example. Well, in that case, it's likely that the exposure therapy will do more harm than good. Or someone might go through cognitive behavioral therapy and just become more obsessed about their own thinking without necessarily gaining any insight into how they might relate to those thoughts differently. So I've seen people be worse off after having done all sorts of forms of therapy. And I have to admit too that there are quite a few people who have been to my office who are worse off as a result of it. And that's not because I do debriefing or group therapy or past life therapy or anything like that, but it's you know, sometimes people make discoveries or hear stuff or interpret what happens in a way that was just not very useful. So I hope this might get you to consider what you're doing a bit more if you're seeing clients. If you want a good book on the topic that documents some of this stuff, you can check out Redirect by Timothy Wilson. Really good book. He's also the author of Strangers to Ourselves, The Adaptive Unconscious, one of my favorite psychology books. As always, if you like my ideas, if you're looking to make some change in your life or you're looking for mentoring, you can get in touch with me at provocativehypnosis.com. Thanks for listening.